Well, good morning. This is the Lew Rockwell Show, and it's great to have as our guest this morning Mr. Jon Rappoport. Jon is an American journalist and author. He lives in San Diego with his wife, Dr. Laura Thompson, with whom he does much work advocating alternative medicine. He was educated at Amherst College in Massachusetts. Since the year 2001, he's written for his site, NoMoreFakeNews.com. He's been an investigative reporter for 20 years, author of The Matrix Revealed and other important works. We could talk about many things. You write about many things and know about many things, but let's start off with the very sinister Obama administration project to map our brains.
Of course, this was announced in the wake of the Sandy Hook killings, but obviously it was a project that was on the boards for a long time, and politicians were looking for the opportune moment to spring it on everybody. Initially funded with about $100 million and estimated to go up over $1 billion, Obama announced this as a 10-year kind of Manhattan project for the brain, to map everything possible about what the brain is doing. And presumably, according to the administration, this would somehow prevent these kinds of massacres because researchers would be able to detect and perhaps even predict when people were going to go off like this. And many scientists have criticized it right from the beginning as being a ridiculous idea, that they would be able to really understand all of the ever-changing patterns of the brain. But actually, and this goes back to a prior discussion you and I had about psychiatry and its motives and drugs and so forth, the brain mapping project is really all about control. It's about learning enough about the brain so that government and its allied corporate friends and law enforcement and so forth can actually bring upon us a kind of minority report civilization where people are going to be making all sorts of predictions about who's going to go off and kill other people and arrest them beforehand, put them in psych wards, force them to see psychiatrists and be drugged. This is really where it's going. This is the objective, and the truth doesn't really matter in that case, whether or not neurologists and psychiatrists really understand the brain or don't. They, as they always have, can pretend to. And then they can work out computer models and parameters and algorithms and so forth to say, well, we know that this type of person is prone to violence from their brain patterns, and therefore they should be brought into custody as a preventive measure or put on a 72-hour hold in a psych ward and examined and drugged and so forth. It's more totalitarian state dished up to us in the form of science.
Sort of a high-tech KGB sort of psychiatry. The late Dr. Thomas Saz pointed out that this has always been psychiatry. It's always been an arm of the state. Its purpose has always been to control dissidents and just anybody for purposes of the government.
You and I both share a great admiration for Dr. Saz and his work as I guess you would call him a political libertarian. He was on to the objectives of psychiatry right from the beginning, that all of its labels of so-called mental disorders and drugs that ensued, all of this was really an effort to control. It had nothing to do with reality or science, and that persists to this day. And now we can look forward, in heavy quotes, this, next month, I believe, we'll see the introduction of the newest edition of the Psychiatric Bible called the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which greatly expands the range and number of the now 297 official mental disorders. And this is just about, as Zaz keeps saying, more control over people, more ability to say, you see, what you're thinking is not only debatable, but it's a symptom of a disease. And therefore we have to treat you, which is, in fact, the old Soviet model, just with better PR.
You know, Jon, when we think about getting to know the brain and seeing who might be violence prone, will we be able to understand the brain of somebody who might be signing death warrants over his scrambled eggs in the morning to send in drones to murder children in Afghanistan?
That's a great question. That's not just a good question. That's a great question. Well, one thing we could be sure of is that if we could understand that pattern, somehow that person over his scrambled eggs would be exempted from examination to determine his state of brain. But exactly, that's exactly the point here, is that certain people, of course, when given a free pass by the state, would be exempted from all of this. Whereas the person in the street, the average citizen, especially people living out in rural areas who are major targets for gun control, gun grabbing, and so on, they would be first in line to be analyzed and to be brought in. But government officials, never happen.
No, and of course, when we talk about gun violence, it doesn't apply to Mr. Obama and the other world purveyors of gun violence. How many guns has the U.S. government got stockpiled? How many innocents have been murdered by these guns, shot by various government employees? Nobody even seems to have a sense of irony that Obama's who's sending out people to kill people with guns every single day is somehow concerned about gun violence.
Absolutely. And if he were domestically at all interested in gun violence, he would begin by targeting and illustrating exactly where in the United States the illegal gun violence is happening. And that would be, you want to have a war on crime or something like that. Well, that's where you would start. But we will hear nothing about that at all. That is not the point. Ending gun violence has nothing to do with the administration, this one or the past administrations recently. Not at all. It's all about taking guns away. It has nothing to do with curbing gun violence because, in fact, as you've just illustrated, the government wants to be the only people that have guns.
Will Grigg pointed out to me that there are no statistics, for example, on how many people are shot by policemen.
Right.
We know that there are, last year there were 55 policemen killed, but we have no idea how many people were killed by policemen. They deliberately don't keep these statistics.
Nor do they keep statistics in any reasonable way about enemy combatants in foreign adventures, aka wars. You do see some statistics, but it doesn't even begin to really add up all of these imperial incursions that governments make, especially the U.S. government in foreign lands, for example. I know you're well aware of this. Between the two wars in Iraq, we had the famous 60 Minutes interview with Madeleine Albright in which she said, well, we think that our economic sanctions, which have killed 500,000 children in Iraq, that's worth it. We're willing to pay that price for the results that we get. So, we're talking about a seesaw here with, 1 million tons on one end and a feather on the other end when you're talking about what the government does to create violence and death and suffering, and what citizens of the country do.
Thanks to everybody who shops at Amazon.com. I wanted to mention that LRC gets a small commission at no cost to the buyer every time you go to Amazon through an LRC link, any of the widgets on the page for books or other items, or entering through the ad at the top left-hand corner of the front page. So thanks again, and it's a huge help. And Amazon, what a great company. It's just extraordinary. You don't need to go down to the local bricks and mortar place. You don't have to pay, in many cases anyway, sales taxes. So far as I can tell, virtually everything the human race produces is for sale at Amazon.com. So I highly recommend it. It helps keep LRC alive and growing. So thanks to all of you who shop at Amazon. Not that I would advocate this, but if we had some kind of libertarian DSM, wouldn't we look at exactly what might motivate somebody like Madeleine Albright? I guess it's just evil and, of course, power, the desire for power. But I always think these people who rise high in the government into those kinds of jobs actually like killing people. They like sending people to kill. They like sending people to be killed. They just enjoy the killing. It empowers them. They feel very good about themselves. They feel powerful and important that they can wield the sword and kill 1 million people. How many have been killed in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, aside from as you say, all those who killed by the sanctions themselves, acts of war, of course. These people, not only don't they care, I wonder if they don't actually like it. That would be an entry in my own DSM.
I don't think you can reach any other conclusion than that. I agree with you. I think The story, the rationale, the justification comes afterwards. But originally, you have these people who, as you say, rise up to high positions in government. They are psychopaths and sociopaths by any definition that one would want to give, and they do enjoy it. They do want that power. And then they tell themselves and everybody else stories to explain it and justify it. A recent example that really horrifies me is the government decision to allow children, young children, to be tested with the anthrax vaccine. I mean, this is a highly dangerous and destructive vaccine that's been shown over and over again, given to troops, our troops, for no reason whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And now, for no reason whatsoever, it's going to be tested on American children. I mean, this, you could only say, would reflect a desire to do great harm, because there's no scientific or rational reason to do this. It could only be done by sadists for sadistic reasons, nothing else. And I think that the public, people want to believe the best about everybody. They want to make excuses for other people. They want to say, well, that was a mistake, or it was incompetence, or sloppy work, or they were trying at least, or, it wasn't really their fault and all of this. They don't want to look at evil. They don't want to look at evil people and say, these people are evil. That's it. But that's what I've been forced to conclude, because what other explanation really is there?
And yet it seems to me that the typical American, if there is such a thing, would hold that the American government has never done anything wrong. It might have made mistakes out of the sort of the goodness of its heart. Maybe it got its boots stuck in the quagmire in Vietnam, or that kind of language. But the U.S., unlike other governments that the U.S. government doesn't like, the U.S. has never done anything wrong, when clearly it has to be one of the great wrongdoers in the history of the human race.
Absolutely, no question about it. And I've had arguments with friends about this. For example, a person will say, and I wrote about this recently, the government is owned by corporations. So the government has been totally corrupted. So I wrote an article about this, and I said, well, what does that phrase really mean, corrupted? You mean that government officials are just simply robots? They don't really sell out voluntarily. They don't really join the ranks of oppressors. But it's just something that they can't avoid. Somehow it's done to them. When they take a bribe, when they sell out, when the lobbyist hands money under the table, when some gigantic military contractor sits down with the Pentagon for the latest weapon of mass destruction plan, et cetera, the government people have no responsibility. Is that what you're saying? That they just simply can't resist it? Somehow the internal makeup is such that they have no control. They just have to go along. I said, this is absurd. If there's a bribe in a sports contest, it's pretty obvious. There's the briber and the bribee. They're both wrong. They both committed a crime. But somehow the government is off the hook. These people there's just something about them they just can't resist. It's completely insane.
And yet it is the organization, the only one that claims the right to actually initiate violence against the innocent. It's above the law. It applies the law to the rest of us. And of course, military-industrial complex and big pharma, there are plenty of very bad private entities involved with the government. But it's actually the government that empowers them and enables them to do their damage.
Absolutely. If you or I were the president of the United States and we were in the position of being able to, quote, sell out to some major corporation, and here we are sitting in the White House thinking, okay, let's see, I've got the Department of Homeland Security, I've got the FBI, all these people have guns, I've got the Department of Justice, they do whatever I tell them. I have the Army and the Air Force and the Navy and the Marines. I've got all these under my control. I can tell them to do anything I want to at the drop of a hat. But somehow, I feel compelled to sell out to a giant corporation because I'm disempowered. I don't have any force at my disposal. I can't prosecute these people. It's totally absurd. Yes, the government has the last word. When the FDA approves a toxic drug that they know is toxic, that's going to maim and kill people, because some pharmaceutical company decides that they want the FDA to do this, and it's not the responsibility of the FDA. I had a long interview with Dr. Barbara Starfield, who died several years ago, who wrote really a heroic review that somehow was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2000 that illustrated that as a conservative figure, the U.S. medical system kills 225,000 people every year, and 106,000 of those pharmaceutical drugs that are approved by the FDA. And I said, well, how in the world does the FDA get away with this? And on that point, she really tap danced around the subject. She would refuse to assign responsibility to the FDA. It was all government was corrupted by pharmaceutical companies and so forth. I said, yes, but the buck stops at the FDA. If they don't approve a drug, it doesn't get out there. And I went nowhere with that. We went around and around, and she just refused to say, somebody in government is responsible. That's why they're there. It's amazing.
This is the one issue that is never brought up in politics, that is the role of the state. It's never discussed. The conservatives have their own bugbears, the liberals have their own. It's never addressed, never discussed, never taught in school. You're not supposed to look at it. You're supposed to always avert your eyes. It's actually the only issue, the only fundamental issue in politics is when does the government get to do these things to innocent people, and of course there are private interests associated with them and so forth. But not only wouldn't your doctor discuss it, nobody discusses this.
No, they don't. Absolutely not. And of course, media, major media wouldn't touch this with a 10-foot pole. I've talked to reporters over the years about this issue in one form or another. And we've had very frank conversations about it. I'd say, well, do you guys ever write about state power? Anymore? Did you ever? Did you care about this issue? Don't you think people would buy your newspapers by the ton if you began to seriously expose this kind of thing? Watergate was nothing. And look how many papers they sold on that alone to bring government to heel and show how responsible they are in some way. There are issues that, make Watergate look like a Sunday picnic. And these reporters would say to me, yes, we understand that, but we just can't do that. Well, why not? Because our editors won't permit it. They simply won't permit it. So I say, in other words, you could write a story on this line, something that would really shock people. And you would take this story into your editor's office, and he would just flat out refuse to print it. And they said, yeah, absolutely. But it doesn't even get to that because we know what the parameters are. So we don't risk our careers by trying to do that. Absolutely not. If we did, we would be warned. And then if we persisted, we would be fired and blacklisted. So that's where the media are on that.
Well, that is where the media are, but thank goodness that's not the whole media, John. Thank goodness for you and nomorefakenews.com. And, of course, we'll link to your site, to your archives, your Facebook page, your YouTube channel. And all I can say is keep doing the work you're doing. You're influencing a lot of people. You're helping get the truth out. And it's very, very important. And thanks for coming on the show today, too.
Thank you so much, Lew. It's always a pleasure.
Bye-bye, John.
Bye-bye.
Well, thanks so much for listening to the Lew Rockwell Show today. Take a look at all the podcasts. There have been hundreds of them. There's a link on the upper right-hand corner of the LRC front page. Thank you.